Kenneth McKenzie, Viscount Fortrose, who subsequently became the last Earl of Seaforth, is generally best remembered in clan histories as the man who raised the Seaforth Highlanders. While that marks an important place in history for him, he is also someone who's long fascinated me for a life that was enviously colourful but ultimately movingly tragic. Departing from the traditional characterization of him as a military leader, a recent biography of the last Earl by Tony Scotland, entitled Gimcrack, A Rake's Progress, attempts to portray this man largely as a frivolous playboy, and I quote, born with too great a sense of entitlement and too little a sense of responsibility, who never found any purpose in life. The nickname Gimcrack was a reference to a small grey racehorse that was famously painted by George Stubbs and was used at the time to mean, in Tony Scotland's words, a worthless trifle, a dandy who might be a lightweight but was at least an all-rounder. In this account, Seaforth's lonely death at sea in the middle of the Atlantic and far from home is somehow seen as the appropriate conclusion of a worthless life. While what I had previously written in my history of the Mackenzies, May We Be Britons, concurs with much in this extremely readable and well-researched book, I have to profess that I've always had a greater degree of sympathy with this man whose intimate portrait as a boy, beside his tutor, my own ancestor's cousin, Dr. James McKenzie, I'm fortunate enough to own. This painting by the Scottish portraitist Catherine Reed conveys the artist's sense of the affection that evidently existed between the two of them, and I can also sympathise with that affection, owing to the cultural and intellectual interests I admire in both of them. What is more, it was in particular the last Earl's love of Naples that inspired me recently to return to this unique city to see for myself exactly where he was living and what it was about this location that kept him there in the early 1770s. It was not hard to see why he was neither the first nor the last Briton to fall in love with Italy, and in particular with Naples. In my opinion, when he is compared to many other largely mediocre products of the British aristocracy in his day, the last Earl of Seaforth unquestionably did achieve purpose in life, and that was no small achievement given the decline of so many Highland families that had participated in the disastrous Jacobite risings that scarred the first half of the 18th century for them. As I wrote in May We Be Britons, remarkably, the next 50 or so years saw changes that were to make possible the social, political, and financial recognition within a wider Britain that had always been the ultimate ambition of the Scottish elite since the union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1603. Lord Fortrose, as he was known for much of his life, was one Highland magnate who achieved full integration within the British establishment at this time. It is true that the Seaforth family's rehabilitation in the 18th century was slow and faltering at first. The last Earl did not appear to have paid much attention to his estates, spending more of his time in London or on the European continent, while his more fertile eastern Bran estate had been brought into good order. The extensive efforts on the part of his unpopular factor, George Gillanders, to improve his hitherto neglected Lewis estate were obstructed by voluntary emigration and local opposition to a flax spinning factory that had been introduced to, I quote, assist the poorest people and keep them in temper and spirit. As a consequence, in 1778, Seaforth was indebted to the sum of £74,000. The total annual income from his rents of about £4,000 was insufficient for him to meet both the interest on his debt and the cosmopolitan and dilettante lifestyle he led. His main ambitions, however, were directed with the hope of securing the restoration of his family's peerage, which had been forfeit since 1715, when his grandfather took part in the Jacobite rising of that year. He was Member of Parliament for Caithness between 1768 and 1774, being listed on the few occasions that he attended the Commons as a friend of the government, although it must be said that he appeared to have little inclination to represent his family's traditional interest in Ross-shire in the House of Commons. The acquisition from the Duke of Grafton, First Lord of the Treasury and soon to become Prime Minister, in November 1766 of the Irish Viscountcy of Fortrose, which was raised to the Irish Earldom of Seaforth on Grafton's rejoining the government in 1771, however, owed more to the fact that in 1765 he married Lady Caroline Stanhope, the daughter of the Earl of Harrington and the Duke of Grafton's first cousin. It was above all his social connections that achieved his ambition, and I would suggest his social integration with those in power at the time should not be underestimated. Another significant moment in Seaforth's ambition to restore his family's fortunes came when he returned to Scotland briefly in 1777 to take the opportunity of proving his loyalty to the government by raising a regiment, the 72nd Regiment of Foot, when the British Army needed new troops for the American War of Independence. This was a body of 1,130 men, principally from Wester Ross, in which the officers were largely gentlemen of his own name. 500 men were enlisted among his immediate vassals, and about 400 from the estates of the McKenzies of Scatwell, Kilcoy, Redcastle, and Applecross, including a considerable number of men who were dubbed Wild McRaes from the west coast. This regiment, which was to make a proud and significant contribution to British military history over the years to come, came to be known as the Seaforth Highlanders. But sadly, Seaforth was not to reap any material rewards for his loyal endeavours during his own lifetime. His lifestyle, which to be fair had brought him social status, forced him into debt, leading him to sell the Seaforth estate in January 1781 to his cousin, Thomas McKenzie Humberston, for £100,000 sterling. It was perhaps of greater importance to the Earl, however, that this transaction enabled him both to marry his long-standing mistress, Harriet Powell, and to provide for her future. I would suggest that the relinquishing of his ancestral estates was proof of a true devotion to her, and we should recognise the sincere humanity behind his actions. Seaforth had taken up with Harriet following Caroline's death, and by the summer of 1773 she was established in one of the Adam brothers' fashionable houses in the Adelphi, the new neoclassical development on the Thames. At that time, to keep a courtesan was common and accepted behaviour amongst the aristocracy, but to live with her was a rarity, let alone to go on to marry her in an age when marriage among his class was most often for social, political, or economic advantage. Harriet had her portrait painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds and Catherine Reed, who, as we've seen, Lord Fortrose sat for as a boy in Rome, and Reed's portrait of her was popular enough to be engraved. Her celebrity, however, could never provide the status that his first wife had. Indeed, the union was hushed up by the family, evidently with great effect, as is testified by a letter I came across that the last Lord Seaforth's grandson wrote more than a half a century later. Keith Stuart McKenzie was to assert that there was no Lady Seaforth of the name of Powell, and certainly none who was an actress. Even the description of actress was something of a euphemism. An apothecary's daughter, Harriet had, like Emma Hamilton, the equally unconventional wife of Seaforth's close friend Sir William, graduated as a courtesan from Mrs. Hayes's notorious Covent Garden establishment. Besides her outstanding beauty, Harriet was described as having uncommon good sense, vivacity, and judgment, together with a delicacy of sentiment. Even the usually cynical Town and Country magazine celebrated the true warmth of the couple's relationship when it wrote that Seaforth took every occasion to testify his regard and esteem for her. Her taste in dress and character were manifested at every masquerade, in which she was imitated by women of the first fashion, who at once envied Harriet her lover, and those charms that had so completely captivated him. In fine, they are perhaps the happiest couple out of the pale of matrimony within the hills of mortality, and this alliance, which appears to have a very permanent basis, may be cited as one that does the least scandal to morality in the whole cycle of polite gallantry. At a time of stricter morals, when it came to such things, we get a sense of a defiantly profound love between the couple. The hoped-for future for this most perfect of couples that the sale of the Seaforth estates was intended to bring, however, was to be tragically short-lived. Seaforth's military endeavours were, you see, soon hit with fraught difficulties. Despite an initial undertaking that the Seaforth Highlanders were only to be employed defending the Channel Islands from America's French allies, rumours reached the men that they were to be sent to the distant and disease-ridden subcontinent of India. When next pay was not forthcoming, most likely the Fourth of London as much as of the officers, the men mutinied and set up camp on Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. There they were supplied food by the sympathetic townsfolk. There was even a false claim in the newspapers that Seaforth begged his men for his life, and his relationship with them certainly reached a low point during this dispute. But after 3 days a compromise was agreed with the government, whereby Seaforth promised his men that he would accompany them in person wherever they were sent, and this was reported to have been met by cheers. In the end, this noble promise on his part was to prove fatal. After he and Harriet accompanied the regiment to their first posting in Guernsey, Harriet tragically died when returning on a packet boat to Southampton in December 1789, probably still in her 20s. We then find a devastated Seaforth turning increasingly to the bottle. It was next announced that the regiment was to be posted to Madras in India, as had been feared, a trip that everyone expected to be one way. But what was life in London society without Harriet anyway? Thus Seaforth honoured his promise to his men that he would accompany them, abandoning his once comfortable and glittering lifestyle, to encounter, in the words of one contemporary chronicler, the privations and inconveniences of a long voyage, and the dangers and fatigues of military service in a tropical climate. After sailing for 2 months, just before reaching the island of St. Helena in the mid-Atlantic, scurvy broke out on board the ship, and aged only 37, Seaforth succumbed to the disease. He was buried by his now devoted men at sea. It is known that a pibroch, a lament mourning Seaforth's death, was composed by the chief piper Roderick McKenzie, but sadly its score wasn't kept for posterity after the grief-stricken men begged Roderick never to play it again. The East India Company reported his death as follows: "A warm zeal for his country's service was distinguishable in the last Earl of Seaforth in the act of raising soldiers for the army, and happy talent for promoting the reciprocal interests of his sovereign and the people was invigorated by a very liberal spirit, which strongly recommended him to the people's esteem. This country has sustained a considerable loss in the death of his lordship, who was an enterprising and brave officer." Kenneth had always been sickly. When visiting the Seaforths at their estate in County Durham in April 1758, his tutor Dr. James McKenzie wrote to his cousin John McKenzie of Delvin of the young lord's puny fabric, and thought his health would be better served by sending him to his native country, rather than spoiling him by sending him abroad again. When he later took to drink following Harriet's loss, his delicate constitution could not take it, and this appears to have contributed to his early death. A letter between his good friends, Sir Joseph Banks and Sir William Hamilton, dated 13th of February 1782, stated, "Poor Seaforth, you read by the papers, is dead. He went off suddenly and was drunk when he died. It would have been extraordinarily lucky if he had been sober, as it was for some time his custom to keep a regular fire of drams day and night whenever he was awake." But should we judge the last Earl of Seaforth's life as a tragic waste? Personally, I can't help thinking that he made a greater contribution to the world than many of those with wealth and power in today's supposedly more socially aware and advanced society have, let alone when compared to many of his own aristocratic contemporaries. The last Earl's foremost interests, it should be pointed out, were neither political nor financial. It was his intellect and sociability that allowed him the full and complete integration into British society that his ancestors had so long craved. It was the young Kenneth's long exile on the European continent, initially in the admirable company of Dr. James, a physician who pioneered inoculation against smallpox, as well as an historian at the forefront of the Edinburgh Enlightenment, that encouraged him to become the grand tourist par excellence, engendering in him a remarkably cosmopolitan outlook. He was thus among a number of Scottish émigrés who from 1688 onwards settled in France, Spain, Russia and Italy, where they made a major contribution to the economic, military, and in his case the intellectual life of these host countries. He may thus be regarded, to quote the words of the Jacobite historians Evelyn Cruikshanks and Edward Corp, as one of the first Europeans. As a boy, we find him in Naples with his father in the 1750s, who is seen here in a portrait from that time attributed to the Roman artist Agostino Masucci. And we know that he went on to travel extensively in Europe with Dr. James. I'm sure that it was the influence of this kind and clever man who was dubbed benevolent McKenzie that shaped the young boy's later passions. The two of them were in Rome when Catherine Reed painted them in 1752, and the architects Robert and James Adam later met them in Nice early in 1755, when Robert remarked that he had never seen a little creature of more spirit, sense, and sweetness than this little milord, as they call him, who speaks all languages with equal facility. It is also interesting to note a third affectionate presence in this portrait, a greyhound, not only because the love of dogs that Fortrose shared with Sir William Hamilton was evident in Pietro Fabrice's later depiction of those men in Naples, but a map I own of by the hydrographer royal Murdo McKenzie, a mutual cousin of mine and Dr. James, that is dedicated to the then Viscount Fortrose, shows that the two supporters he chose for his coat of arms were in fact greyhounds. Two etchings by the highly popular Italian artist Giovanni Battista Piranesi, which I'm also lucky enough to possess, and which are dedicated to Fortrose, each bear the inscriptions Milord Fortrose, peritissimo in tutte le arti liberali, highly skilled in all the liberal arts. And in June 1763, after encountering him in the Duchy of Brunswick, Dr. Johnson's biographer James Boswell described him in his diary as a lively, pretty young man with the most perfect elegance of manners, having been abroad a great many years. Boswell scholars suggest that in Scottish usage, pretty would have then meant polite, amiable, and easy in company. During the period between 1764 and 1768, Fortrose was resident in England, and in 1766 he became a member of the Society of Dilettanti, appearing in one of the pair of Sir Joshua Reynolds's group portraits of the Society, alongside his good friends Sir William Hamilton, the naturalist Sir Joseph Banks, and Sir Watkin Williams Wynne. The latter came from a family of Welsh Jacobites, and shared with Hamilton and Fortrose a passion for music and theatricals, as well as for art. Seaforth was known to have attempted to buy Raphael's Madonna della Sedia on one occasion. Members of the Society of Dilettanti all had a common experience of the Grand Tour. They lent their financial and powerful social support, first to Italian opera, and later to the discovery and publication of ancient art, architecture, and the civilizations of Greece and Italy, as well as giving their patronage to young British artists. Seaforth also became a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and the progressive interest he shared with this enlightened circle accounts for his inclusion in a trip aboard the Admiralty yacht Augusta in June 1775, which he and Banks took in the company of the celebrated Omai, the first Tahitian to visit England. In his fellow Scot, Sir William Hamilton, the British envoy to Naples, Fortrose found a particular kindred spirit, and the two men formed a close and lasting friendship. They shared a passion for Roman antiquities, and were among the first to realize the importance of the discoveries of Herculaneum and Pompeii. This is Pietro Fabrice's depiction of the excavations there. And as I hope these photographs from my recent trip there show, I can also vouch for the huge debt we owe these men for their foresight. Both also had a love of music, as well as being active patrons of contemporary Neapolitan painters. On the 6th of November 1770, Lord Fortrose, as he then was, gave a sumptuous musical feast, a lavish entertainment for the visiting musicologist, Dr. Charles Burney. We went to Lord Fortrose, with whom we were to dine. It is impossible for anyone to do the honours of his house better than Lord Fortrose. We were all at our ease, all cheerful and happy. A painting which Fortrose commissioned from Pietro Fabrice, now in the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, portrays just such a scene, with a chamber concert in progress in Fortrose's Neapolitan residence. The host, standing with his back to us, is listening to William Hamilton and the musician Gaetano Pugnani, both playing the violin, while Leopold Mozart and his young son Wolfgang, who visited Naples in May 1770, accompany the two gentlemen on the harpsichord. Fortrose's protégé, the Neapolitan composer Niccolò Jommelli, has been further identified as the man writing at the green-covered table in the companion painting. The Mozart, who had met Hamilton in London, attended the first performance of Jommelli's opera Armida Abbandonata at the Teatro San Carlo. It was 5 years earlier that Fortrose was expelled from Naples for speaking disrespectfully of the king in the theatre, perhaps understandable given King Ferdinand's notoriously uncouth and boorish nature, and only thanks to his friendship with Hamilton that he was not only allowed to return to the kingdom, but went on to become an intimate friend of the royal circle in Naples. As well as being accomplished on the harpsichord and the violin, Fortrose was himself an amateur artist of some note and gave paintings to several friends, including Hamilton, who noted A Rising Sun by Lord Fortrose on his list of paintings in the Palazzo Sessa. I managed to acquire this small drawing by him, which had been given to his niece. Charles Burney, who was asked to view Fortrose's collection of medals, cameos, intaglios, Etruscan vases, pictures, etc., described his host as a lively, sensible, and accomplished young nobleman, with a person very manly and pleasing. He has great talents and taste. He both draws and paints very well, understands perspective, rides, fences, dances, swims, and plays the harpsichord. The collection that Burney viewed, and which can be seen in Fabrice's paintings, included many of the type of objects of everyday life from antiquity that Hamilton was collecting at this time, and which were subsequently purchased for the British Museum in 1772. In 1769, Hamilton was told that Fortrose was now stark raving after cameos and intaglios. Just such a cameo that belonged to Fortrose survives today. Carved with a scene not fit for a lady, it depicts two satyrs attempting to ravish a third, while a Maenad looks on. It is clear why Fortrose was considered the life and soul of the English community in Naples. Recently, I managed to work out that Fortrose's residence in Naples' Via Chiaia, which is just round the corner from the Teatro San Carlo, was the building known at the end of the 19th century as the Palazzo Giroux, after a subsequent owner, and is now a hotel in which I stayed one night. The enfilade, painted by Pietro Fabrice, is now divided into separate bedrooms with en-suites, but I believe that by chance the room I stayed in must have been on the spot where Mozart played. On the Friday beforehand, I also managed to visit Lord Fortrose's villa, once the casino of the Count of Friso, and subsequently named the Villa Pavoncelli, just outside the centre of Naples in Posillipo, which was also painted by Pietro Fabris in another rather fabulous painting I coincidentally once sold at Bonham's. This is the balcony today on which the concert can be seen under the awning of Viscount Fortrose's heraldic blue and gold in Fabrice's painting. And this is the passageway that can be seen leading to the private beach. Cassini, near to the shore of Posillipo, such as the adjacent villa that features in Paolo Sorrentino's recent film Partenope, which is a kind of homage to Naples, shown with a similar balcony in this poster, served mainly for sea bathing when the court moved to this vicinity in the summer, while also making it possible to keep an eye on the behaviour of Vesuvius at all times. And the scene we see in Fabrice's painting was described perfectly in May 1770 by Patrick Bryden. Sea bathing, Bryden wrote, we have found to be the best antidote against the effects of the sirocco, and this we certainly enjoy in great perfection. Lord Fortrose, who is the soul of our community here, has provided a large commodious boat for this purpose. We meet every morning at 8 o'clock and row about half a mile out to sea, where we strip and plunge into the water. After bathing, we have an English breakfast at his lordship's, and after breakfast a delightful little concert, which lasts for half an hour. Pietro Fabris, who appears to have become regarded as their friend and equal, accompanied Hamilton and Fortrose on a trip to Sicily when he was commissioned to depict Fortrose in his carriage in the picturesque Piazza Villiena, known as the Quattrocanti in Palermo, which will be familiar to many who have watched Netflix's recent adaptation of Lampedusa's Il Gattopardo, in which it features prominently. On that Sicilian trip, the three men made a groundbreaking ascent of Mount Etna, an arduous journey that was no easy undertaking. This is Fabrice's depiction of Etna from Catania. By calculating how long it would take for the vegetation to become established around Etna and Vesuvius, seen here in another of Fabrice's depictions, which they compared to ancient descriptions of the area, as outlined in Hamilton's observations on Mount Vesuvius, Mount Etna, and other volcanoes. They were among the first to argue that the world had to be far older than the 6,000 years most then believed it to be. As a direct result of this, and a mark of his contribution to the knowledge of his day, Seaforth was soon after elected as a Fellow of the prestigious Royal Society, later going on to sponsor the membership of his friend, Captain James Cook. Hogarth's famous series, The Rake's Progress, shows the decline and fall of Tom Rakewell, the spendthrift son and heir of a rich merchant, who comes to London, wastes all his money on luxurious living, prostitution, and gambling, and as a consequence is imprisoned in the Fleet Prison and ultimately Bethlehem Hospital. From the story I have just described, I would argue that is not a fair parallel to the life of Kenneth McKenzie, Viscount Fortrose, and Earl of Seaforth. In contrast, the magazine Town and Country wrote the following epitaph for the last Earl of Seaforth. The time may probably come when Lord S will eclipse many who are esteemed the first-rate planets of learning and intelligence. In the meantime, he will most likely indulge the bent of his disposition, and blend the philosophy of reason with the gallantry and gaiety of the polite world. I believe it is precisely those qualities of intellect and amiable personality that clearly inspired deep affection from those he encountered in his life, rather than the more common route of advancement via political scheming or the accumulation of wealth, that allowed this remarkable man's success in achieving an ambition that had for so long escaped his Seaforth ancestors, which was to find himself fully integrated into the elite society of Britain. In the light of that, we should be all the more sorry for the calamities that saw his and Harriet's tragic and untimely deaths.